from Hampton Plantation State Historic Site located on the coast of South Carolina in McClellanville. I'm Ranger Hannah, and today I'm talking about some of the stories that we discuss on our plantation sites about freedom and slavery before and after the Civil War, but specifically today about freedom seekers, people who might have tried to find their freedom even before the end of the war by escaping the plantation. The people enslaved on plantations like Hampton faced very harsh conditions working in rice fields, the threat of being separated from their families, and of course the threat of physical punishment and other things. That did mean that it was dangerous to stay here, but it was also very dangerous to escape. Slave patrols existed in South Carolina by 1704, and in areas like Charleston they're especially vigilant because of things like the Stono Rebellion in 1739. So escaping, if they were recaptured, could mean very harsh punishments or even death. Even navigating the swamps out here, assuming they weren't recaptured, was very dangerous. There's gators, there's water snakes, the mosquitoes are carrying diseases and things like that. Even if they could make it to the free states in the north or to Spanish Florida, they weren't necessarily safe. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant they could be recaptured and sent back into slavery in the South. Still, people braved these risks to try and leave the plantations and find their freedom. One of the main records that we have for freedom seekers are runaway advertisements placed in newspapers by the enslavers when people went missing from the plantation. This is an example of one from Hampton. Two young men named Joe and Sogo, who were enslaved here, left, and then when they were missing, the advertisement was placed to try and find them again and return them to the plantation. So this includes their physical descriptions so that people can identify them, as well as the offer for a reward if they were returned. Leaving the plantation wasn't always a permanent bid for freedom. There are some examples of people who temporarily left to try and find family members. An example of this from Hampton in 1791, an enslaved man named Toby left without permission and was considered a runaway, but the advertisement that we have for him indicates that they thought he might have been trying to see family members. He had been sold to Hampton from another neighboring plantation, and his family was still there where he was separated from them, but was trying to at least see them. People escaping the plantation didn't always go north or even south to Florida. Sometimes they were heading into the swamp to hide out there. A good example of that from Hampton, there was a man named Jack, enslaved here, who in 1821 left the plantation with another group of freedom seekers and traveled the Santee River by canoe. They hid out in the Santee Delta in the swamp as an example of a maroon colony. Maroon colonies were groups of freedom seekers who had left the plantation to hide out in the swamp. These were basically small villages or colonies that were hidden away where people could not find them and force them to return to the plantation, living their day-to-day lives, but in the swamp. South Carolina had a very high percentage of maroon colonies compared to other states because there were people working on the coast in rice fields that were familiar with the swamps and with the waterways that they could use to get away from the plantations. There were a large number of people who were actually born in Africa and may have had more experience navigating this kind of climate. And plus, South Carolina had a very large enslaved population, especially on the coast in areas around Charleston. Up to 80 or 90% of the population were enslaved African or African Americans. So what actually happened to these freedom seekers who left the plantation? Unfortunately, in many cases, we don't really know for sure. Some may have managed to find freedom in other states and other locations, living in maroon colonies further north in Florida, but in some cases they may have been recaptured. For Joe and Sogo, we do have records from after that runaway ad that indicates somebody named Sogo was still on the plantation. That may have been him. Toby, because we do think he was trying to temporarily escape, he may have returned to the plantation. For someone like Jack, he was actually recaptured and then put to death. So there were a lot of different things that could happen. We don't always know, but we do look at these stories as a way to see what the difficulties facing freedom seekers may have been and what kind of hopes they may have had for their future. If you're interested in more stories about the kinds of resistance that happened on plantations, I do encourage you to check out our sister site's upcoming event, Red Cliff, on these days and times. But thank you for joining me today.